DIY shamanism versus the lineage. In this talk, I want to briefly explore what you might say are contrary approaches to the sacramental use of psychedelics and how they might creatively interact in contemporary psychedelic culture, in the West particularly. So I'm using this opposition, which is clearly, as I will I hope show, a somewhat arbitrary opposition, but it can be used to highlight how each approach has its own particular contingencies, its own rules, if you will, inner rules, and look at perhaps why it might be sometimes unwise to simply mix and mash them up. But nevertheless, I do want to challenge any assumptions that these are somehow irreconcilable opposites. And in so doing, I'll be drawing primarily on my own personal experience. In the introduction, it was mentioned, none of us on this stage this morning are academics. So I speak not from theory, really, but primarily from practice. And my own practice has been, well, I would say probably more than 50 years since my original initiation on LSD, and coming up to 30 years of consciously working with LSD and with my own spirit guide at the Crossbones Graveyard, the Goose spirit. But I've also been involved for 25 years in the Santo Daime lineage and played a small part in establishing perhaps one of the first churches here, invisible churches, of course, as they have to be. So I'll be looking at using, as I say, this dichotomy to examine the virtues and also the perils of both approaches, perhaps the limitations, but also how the one might enhance and inform the other, and how their relationship is not essentially combative or adversarial, but complementary and even a porous, symbiotic. So when I use this versus, we're not talking the rumble in the jungle, or even the jumble, with two heavyweights slugging it out. This is more like a remix, you know, with Massive Attack v. Mad Professor, for example. So let's start with some very loose definitions of terms. The lineage. One could say the lineage effectively embodies the idea that plant teachers and medicines are to be used within ritual forms, generally derived from indigenous traditions, some of which may go back hundreds or perhaps even thousands of years. We think of the Huirarica people in Mexico and how that's arguably the longest unbroken tradition of peyote use. And interesting that an essential part of their tradition is the pilgrimage to gather peyote. And the pilgrimage is conceived of, in a sense, taking place in many dimensions, but on earth and in whatever we call it, heaven, the Nahual, the spirit world. So the journey is made both within and without simultaneously, and that's perhaps a strongly defining quality of all these indigenous traditions. The sacrament, therefore, is taken as part of a holistic system. It's not simply you neck some ayahuasca, you will do it within an established form. So often the whole preparation of the ayahuasca is highly ritualized. Participants will often embark on a dieta, a strict diet, and this is not only involving food, but for example, in many traditions, it will involve abstinence from sexual activity for a period before and after. And this is not conceived of as a moral thing or a puritanical thing. This is an energetic idea. During the ceremony, there'll be the chanting of Ikaros, spirit songs, the performance of rituals, particularly various kinds of cleansing and healing works. And seekers will be initiated, perhaps by a native curandero, perhaps by a Western shaman who served an apprenticeship, or perhaps, as is the case in the tradition I follow, into a collective praxis which is then transmitted through a line of masters. And the virtues of such a system are clear. They are time-honored, time-tested methods. And the very fact of that can give emotional and psychological security and alleviate, therefore, physical or psychological anxieties. And they provide a form that encourages both the preparation and the process of psychic integration following a ceremony. However, such a simplistic view, let's go back to there. Such a simplistic view breaks down when you examine it very closely because, well, case in point. So you're looking at an image of some indigenous embroidery by native people in Mexico. But this image the photograph was taken by my wife, Katie, and it was hanging in the house of two Mexican friends we stayed with in Mexico City, Angel and Alicia, who were respectively a brujo and a bruja, and they conducted their own, if you like, DIY shamanism, which was nevertheless derived from indigenous traditions. We'd actually met them in a Santo Daime work that we'd conducted together with two other friends in San Miguel de Allende. Katie and I were there. Actually, we'd been invited to give a 3-day course in shamanism, which, when we accepted it, felt a bit like, wow, we're really taking coals to Newcastle, as we say in England. It felt perhaps rather presumptuous. But in fact, we made a point, really, of bringing our Western approach, our DIY approach to the whole thing. And I think that was definitely the right attitude, rather than trying to teach indigenous Mexican people about their own tradition. But just from that short explanation, you can see I could present that to you as, this is the embodiment of indigenous lineage. But you can see already that image itself passes through about 4 or 5 different channels to be shown here. And I think this is very important because what we're calling, or what I'm calling in this talk, DIY shamanism and the lineage, as I say, although they can be identified as very different approaches, it's very clear that in many ways one informs the other. After all, the lineage evolves over time from people experimenting and gradually refining what they're doing. And equally, what I'm going to call DIY shamanism, although it may seem very anarchistic and chaotic, and those are factors within it, but there's something about chaos has a way of evolving its own forms, as we know, and therefore, in a sense, it will sooner or later evolve rules, although those rules should ideally not be imposed, but willingly chosen. Because all of this is really about seeking to access that thing which, the unnameable really, although we have many names for it, we could call it the zone, the noosphere. We all may be familiar with Karl Popper's world of the objective contents of thoughts. But it is an unknowable realm, ultimately, a world that can be experienced, but not really, and comprehended, but not defined in it, because words themselves will distort our experience. What Don Juan, in Castaneda's books, calls the Nahual. Castaneda, we'll come to him briefly. But couple of points really about when I talk about the perils or the limitations of the lineage. I think, of course, if we seek to represent the lineage, that has, as a Western people, that really has to raise questions of cultural appropriation, which hopefully we are all becoming familiar with. And this is not simply that we're taking something from another culture in terms of what it means to us, because we're often borrowing forms from cultures where the collective, the tribe, the people is the first point of reference. Of course, peoples of the Amazon, of course there are individuals with their own desires, but essentially they are involved in thinking of themselves as part of the whole. They're a little bit perhaps closer to the beehive, the hive mentality. And so when we take those things and then apply them in our culture, we often see Western individualism, which is a beautiful thing in itself, starts to distort the teaching. And so I'm sure all of us have met Western self-styled shamans, and many of us will have had experiences that have led us to question whether that's really the best way to be initiated into a tradition. So let's have a look at the DIY, the chaotic, more informal DIY tradition. I could, just as I picked an image at random really to represent the lineage, this image I've chosen to represent the DIY approach. This is Artaud, Antonin Artaud, the French playwright and poet and psychonaut. Artaud, in the middle of the 20th century, visited Mexico, took peyote, and I believe also took mushrooms, and sought to, in effect, syncretize elements from what he learned, but to combine them certainly with his own tradition. And although I've chosen him as the representative, we could talk of this tradition going back at least, say, to the British Romantic poets, De Quincey, Coleridge, and the French symbolists, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, this idea of derangements of the senses that Rimbaud elevates. And this carries on through the 20th century, and then it starts to connect with academics and thinkers, Huxley, Albert Hoffman, of course, on to Leary, and what we might call bridges between the lineage and the DIY approach. I mean, one, obviously Castaneda, when I first read him, was presented as an anthropologist reporting an integrated, time-honored system, a Yaqui way of knowledge. And as time went by, his books were discreetly moved from anthropology into the fiction sections of libraries. I don't think that in any way invalidates Castaneda as a great teacher, a great trickster teacher, even if Don Juan only exists on some Nahual plain rather than taking the bus to go and find him in Mexico. And Terence, of course, Terence McKenna, who was very familiar with indigenous workings, visited the Amazon and many other places, but brought something of his own, didn't he? The way Terence McKenna approaches the tryptamines owes quite a bit to science fiction as well as to indigenous tradition. And that's my point I'm making here, that what I'm calling DIY shamanism, this very loose, playful term, it's working with Western paradigms as well. And I think that's really important, particularly working with the fact that we've elevated the individual almost, the cult of the individual. So we have to address that as Westerners. And also the transgressive use of psychedelics. This is very important because in many of those indigenous cultures, it's part of the culture. And being the curandero or whatever they call it in their tribe, it's not necessarily a sexy thing, it's a function that you do. You know, ever since Jim Morrison, really, the Western shamans been in, you know, there's the idea it's a great way to pull babes. which is a distortion. It's really a curse, I think, I would argue, as much as a blessing. And so what we're doing in the West often, and particularly speaking as someone who's used LSD for more than 50 years, we're effectively inventing our own systems. And yes, we are, and we should acknowledge this. We're often borrowing from other traditions, both psychedelic and other spiritual traditions, seeking to integrate them, to use what works, and to make a new pattern with which we can work. And that is really what this comes down to. Does it work? That's really my general guideline on whatever path you follow. Does it liberate you? Does it open your mind? Does it make you feel connected to all of life? And ultimately, I would say, does it make you behave as a better human being in your behavior with others? Because really, if you have a great personal gnosis that you know all the mysteries of the universe, but then you behave like a prize asshole, you're really probably not much use to us. So let's have a look at some of our, having got on to the DIY, maybe, oh yeah, this dodgy geezer, for example. This is me in my shamanic persona as John Crow. So I've spoken about this several times at breaking conventions, so I'll be fairly brief on the actual whole story of this. Suffice to say that on the 23rd of November 1996, so nearly 29 years ago, I was initiated by the Goose, this spirit guide. In fact, the spirit of a medieval sex worker who was licensed by the church, but as it turns out, buried in unconsecrated ground, denied a proper Christian burial, and buried in the Crossbones Graveyard, which was about 5 minutes from where I lived in South London. And on the night of the 23rd November 1996, I took a massive dose of LSD. Now, I'd taken acid first age 17 in 1969 and had a couple of extraordinary initiations, on one of which, in fact, I physically turned into a crow, hence John Crow in my name. It followed me all my life until finally, in the 1990s, I accepted it as a kind of shamanistic persona. And so I gave up acid for about 20 years in midlife. I sometimes call that my midlife crisis. Well, I was trying to be a serious writer and things. And I'd come back to it in the 1990s. But by then, of course, I kept taking party acid and sort of getting into the doorway and peering through. But it wouldn't. I'm basically a surrender person. I love to surrender to a power that I trust. And it wasn't doing it for me. So my friend, I'm going to name her because she's already on the other side, and she'd want me to name her. The wonderful Claudia Bolton, or Claudia Egypt, gave me a bottle of liquid acid and said, John, it's just the dose. Give yourself a big dose. So I did. And that's what happened. Somewhere about 11 o'clock at night, I had this spirit come to me, and she began to reveal her secret history and her vision and her practice to me. And all of this took the form of the Southwark Mysteries, this book, which I believe there's about 3 copies available in the bookshop. I commend it to you. But this was a book that grew out of that and formed the basis for what we might call my praxis, my way of working with the Goose. And this evolved over many years, but I used these poems which were received in a heightened state. And these formed the basis for the work that we did. The work evolved into a series of rituals because basically, having had this vision, I discovered that the Crossbones Graveyard, the place that the Southwark Mysteries refers to extensively, was a real place, and that there was a history that I knew nothing about, that it had been the final resting place of sex workers and other paupers, people considered unworthy of a Christian burial, and that it had just been dug up. You know, they say if you dig up the bones of the dead, their spirits will rise. Well, this was dug up to build the Jubilee Line extension electricity substation, which meant they hadn't just dug up the bones, they'd stuck some giant coils down in them. This was one of the early Halloweens of Crossbones. I was actually tripping. I used to take acid every time I did these rituals to reconnect. But on this one, we actually got attacked by some kids with fireworks and stones. Plus, I'd made the mistake of riding my wife Katie's broomstick, unleashing all hell. And after that, I became a reformed character. So I felt if I was responsible for leading crowds around the streets of South London, I'd probably better not be completely off my face. What I found was, though, when I did start performing these work and performing the poems and doing the works, then actually I would enter something very like that state. And this is important. This is the Halloween of Crossbones, reading out the names of the dead. This is what it grew into. The Southwark Mysteries was actually performed in Shakespeare's Globe as a mystery play with the Goose at the very heart of it. And the visible manifestation of this work was at the graveyard, where we began the creation of a shrine dedicated to the outcasts, dead and alive. And you can see there the development of the shrine, which is there to this very day, and also the beginnings of an invisible garden. We actually created a garden without telling anyone. This site was owned by Transport for London, and we found later it was valued at £25 million for development, but it is now a garden. So there's a testimony, in a way, to this work having manifested. But the whole practice and praxis of Crossbones had grown out of my attempts to interpret them, to find out what the Goose wanted of me, and then to serve her. And connecting with Lizzie's previous talk, there was a very strong element of play in this. It was very much about bringing together the sacred and the profane, the spirit and the flesh. And given that my spirit guide was a self-confessed sex worker, of course, she had a great playfulness in the way she dealt with me. So we've evolved this work into establishing ritual forms, first for Halloween and then the monthly vigils. The opening and closing rituals, this importance of binding and loosing, using the contraries of tensing and relaxing, holding the light in shining emptiness, offering ribbons at the gates. These are all expressions of this work. Obviously, we don't meet every month and all take acid in public, standing at a gate in South London. People come to these vigils in various states, often heightened, and as we welcome all faiths and none, we kind of welcome, well, we're not so keen on crack cocaine, obviously, at the gates, but we're all engaged in this great work to reveal the spirit in the flesh, eternity in time. Now, in my work with the Goose, really as a kind of psychedelic medium, I suppose is what I am, it created its own discipline, but of course at times I felt alone and that my own sanity was perhaps sometimes at threat. And I was looking to find some sort of established mediumistic tradition, psychedelic mediumistic tradition, from which I could learn how to navigate between the worlds and how to ground myself when I returned from the journey. So I had a few false starts, drinking ayahuasca with some self-styled Western shamans, which I didn't really do it for me. And I eventually found it in Santo Daime, and so briefly I want to use this as an example of a collective praxis transmitted through a line of masters. And here is my master, Mestre Ireneo, Raimondo Ireneo Serra. Yeah, a truly great man. Great in every sense. He was 7 foot tall. I've seen photos of him. I don't think they're faked. A 7 foot tall descendant of African slaves, a rubber tapper who went into the Amazon, was given ayahuasca by a tribe, but had his own vision, perhaps bringing his own African Catholicism and the Orisha traditions. He had a vision of the Virgin Mary, actually, who came and initiated him. But the Virgin Mary in Santo Daime is also identified with the Queen of the Forest and the Queen of the Moon. So she's also a very animistic agency. And Mestre Ireneo established as a kind of itself a syncretic tradition, Daime appealed especially to mestizo people, people of mixed races, who were often the most marginalized people in Brazilian society, because it drew on folk Catholicism, orishas, Kardecist spiritism, mediumship, and many other esoteric practices. Over the years, it's split into distinct lines or lineages. The joke was always, if you have 2 Daimistas, you probably have 3 churches. And one of these lines came from, there's Mestre in his more spiritual form, with Our Lady, the Queen of the Forest. And the gentleman here is Padrino Sebastião Motto de Melo. And he, along with his wife, Madrina Rita, to the left of him there, the man with the beard and the lady next to him, she's still alive, and she's really the mother of Santo Daime now. And other members of the extended family, all based at Ciao de Mapia in the Amazon. Very briefly, I'd say that we talk about ayahuasca tourism. I think one of the dangers of it is not to recognize the importance of the lineage in South American, among curanderos in South America, how much it passes down through bloodlines. So on there, you see some of the family. To the right, on that side, on the right side of the image, you can see the sons of Padrino Sebastião, who carried on the tradition. And with Padrino Sebastião, this tradition took on some more mediumistic, spiritist elements. So briefly, because I am running out of time, in Santo Daime, the sacrament's drunk 3, 4, or more times during the trabalhos, the ritual works. They can last, 8, 10, 12 hours or more. During it, I talked earlier about it's done as part of an integrated system. So just as you have icaros used by shamans of various kinds, curanderos, here hinos, the hymns, are sung to music with drumming, the shaking of maracas, and the entire group often dancing for an entire work, with the men and women facing each other, divided, so it as a kind of tantric idea, and the whole thing, the idea being to create the corrente, the current, and actually to immerse ourselves in this current so that we really become part of the whole. And this integrated system is very important in Daime. So the Daime is prepared with people singing these hymns, these hinos, and the hinos themselves were received by the masters under the influence of Daime, and all of this is working together in an intensely alchemical process with this idea of combining the female energies of the hyena, the queen, who is rich in DMT, with the male jagubi, the vine, which acts, of course, as to allow the queen to fully penetrate us. And so this discipline, in which we lose ourselves in the collective current, with this sense that Mestre and the other masters have, in a way, opened up the pathways for us into the forest, into our minds. So when I'm in a difficult passage in a Daime work, I will often find myself singing a line from a hino that uncannily addresses the very thing I'm struggling with. And when I'm taking a very big dose of ayahuasca, I often ask Mestre to drink it with me. I find that very helpful. So that's very briefly on the lineage. But of course, this is all about also a personal gnosis and how do we bring it together in community, which is what the theme of today is about. And certainly at Crossbones, that's what we've sought to do, to create a community. It's different with Crossbones, of course. We don't have people turn up on the 23rd of every month at 7 o'clock. That's when they do come. We don't just give them acid in the street. But as I say, there is a practice that derives from these LSD experiences, and LSD is the sacrament of the Goose. And so we're looking to harmonize, whether we're working in the lineage or in DIY, we are looking to harmonize both the individual gnosis and the collective experience. In my book, Grail, which you might also find on the bookshop, near the end I say, in our quest for personal gnosis, may we never lose sight of the small beauties, Blake's minute particulars, the singing of birds, the moon in the blackthorn tree, friendship and community, small acts of care and kindness, the divine love and magic revealed in this world, moment by eternal moment. I've got about a minute, but I've been told to stop. Can I carry on? Thank you. No, not overruling you. But it'd be nice to, yeah, thank you. So, over a quarter of a century of following both practices, I've tried not to get them confused I've never deliberately or, just for fun tried to combine them. But over time, I've observed how they're a subtle confluence and symbiosis of these different approaches. So, for example, those are things I'm doing at Crossbones. I was part of a breaking convention crew that accompanied Don Santos from the Huichol people when he led a pilgrimage to reawake our sacred sites. And I was over the moon, of course, when he began it with a blessing at Crossbones Graveyard. There you can see Santos in the graveyard. When I've been in Mexico, coming back to the start, my Daimista friends told me the Goose is a bombagira in Umbanda and Umbandaime in Brazil. The bombagira is a sex worker spirit. And so people said, you've got to go to Brazil and you've got to go and meet Baixinha, which I did. There she is, dancing in trance. Baixinha, an extraordinary woman, opened a new line called Umbandaime, which is using Santo Daime, but also working with the different orders of spirits. And I went to her, did a ceremony with her, and in the middle of the ceremony went and asked for her protection and for her permission to use what she calls the message of the caboclum, which is what I'm going to finish with. There's my website, crossbones.org.uk. And I did this last time in the closing ceremony as call and response, but for now, because I'm very short of time, I'm simply going to say it. Life, health, happiness, open pathways, health in the body, peace in the spirit, love in the heart. It is this that we wish for ourselves, for our friends and family, for all our brothers and sisters, for the goose and the crow, and for all humanity. May it be so.